I think it is important, calmly and respectfully, to inject a little perspective into the conversation surrounding what has become arguably the most widely read educational hair restoration article in the world through ApetoGentleman. The article is read by millions annually because, contrary to many of the narratives and attempted dismissals surrounding it over the years, the article was never created as a status symbol or manufactured authority exercise. It was built from lived experience, more than 20 years immersed inside one of the most emotionally vulnerable and commercially competitive industries imaginable. 20 years of speaking privately with frightened patients. 20 years of witnessing exceptional work, poor work, emotional desperation, hope, regret, transformation, and sometimes devastating consequences. Trying to make sense of an incredibly emotional decision that became the foundation of the article. Education, transparency, and long-term thinking. And perhaps that authenticity is exactly why the article evolved into something far bigger than I ever anticipated, and why it can't in fact be replicated despite the best efforts. It spread organically and in fact virally because patients shared it privately with other patients trying to avoid making irreversible mistakes. And I will never forget listening to a live radio show where one patient emotionally rang in and said, "This article saved my life." For me, that's one of the most profound and powerful statements I've ever heard a hair loss sufferer say. In that moment, politics, petty jealousy, and attempts to reduce it to just a list suddenly felt completely insignificant. Because when something genuinely helps vulnerable people feel calmer, less isolated, and more informed, the purpose largely speaks for itself. Trying to make sense of an incredibly emotional decision that became the foundation of the article. Education, transparency, and long-term thinking. And perhaps that authenticity is exactly why the article evolved into something far bigger than I ever anticipated, and why it can't in fact be replicated despite the best efforts. It spread organically and in fact virally because patients shared it privately with other patients trying to avoid making irreversible mistakes. And I will never forget listening to a live radio show where one patient emotionally rang in and said, "This article saved my life." For me, that's one of the most profound and powerful statements I've ever heard a hair loss sufferer say. In that moment, politics, petty jealousy, and attempts to reduce it to just a list suddenly felt completely insignificant. Because when something genuinely helps vulnerable people feel calmer, less isolated, and more informed, the purpose largely speaks for itself. As the article grew, so did the many colorful narratives surrounding it. One thing that has always made me smile slightly is hearing people say, "Doctors only want to work with you because of the list." I heard that directly from a colleague in the space recently while I was driving with my wife and kids in the car. We all kind of looked at each other in disbelief because the comment felt so loaded and reductionist that even my kids immediately picked up on it. The ApetoGentleman feature is only one arm of what I do. The wider Specs Hair platform, the educational resources I've built like this podcast, my free ebook, clinic profile pages, and even the in-clinic educational brochure I created for patients, all consistently form part of people's research journey long before they ever book a consultation. People try to replicate aspects of what I've built. I say, fill your boots, because authenticity, lived experience, trust, and long-term credibility are much harder things to imitate. But I bet the brochure idea is in the making if I had to make a bet. It's been built steadily over 2 decades through independent advocacy, legitimate mainstream media exposure across television, radio, countless newspapers, even participation in a Bloomberg documentary. Not manufactured authority, just years of consistently trying to help people navigate a very vulnerable space. So when people reduce everything down to the list, I genuinely chuckle. Perhaps there may be a few more reasons clinics value the association beyond a single article. And importantly, doctors are not paying ApetoGentlemen. A clear disclaimer resides at the top of the article. The reality is clinics who choose to associate with the wider Specs Hair educational and patient advocacy platform do so because they understand and witness the first-hand value of patient education and long-term trust building. In fact, several surgeons featured throughout the article over the years have never paid me Specs Hair or ApetoGentlemen a single penny. We'll let the haters sit with that for a bit. Doctors genuinely embraced the educational purpose behind the article itself. Yeah, naturally there is positive exposure attached to it. but many have openly shared how patients now arrive at consultations calmer, more realistic, and asking far better questions after reading it. Clinics even reference the article directly within consultations, which was written to educate and protect patients and has grown into one of the most widely read resources in hair restoration. Ironically, many people skip past the educational content and jump straight to the surgeon section. Despite the core message remaining the same, surgery should be a last resort. The article was never designed to simply promote names. It was created to help vulnerable and often desperate people avoid dangerously uninformed decisions, think more critically, and move in a far safer direction than blindly following social media advertising designed to prey on insecurity and lack of knowledge. Reluctance in certain corners of the industry openly acknowledge something building trust. But I suppose plausible deniability has always been an old chestnut in this industry. Silence can be remarkably convenient when acknowledgement no longer feels controllable, because surely if the true objective is patient welfare, education, and better long-term outcomes, then an openly accessible educational resource helping millions of vulnerable people should not feel threatening. It should feel valuable. And honestly, that silence at times was deafening, because people rarely go out of their way to avoid acknowledging things they genuinely believe are irrelevant, not quietly imitate things they consider meaningless either. That is where some of the irony lies. While publicly dismissing the concept as just a list, many simultaneously began creating their own annual rankings, prestige positioning pieces, and best doctor frameworks. Not lists, though. Funny how that works, eh? The article never claimed perfection. It never claimed to be official. It simply attempted to help people slow down and think more clearly while navigating one of the most emotionally confusing decisions of their lives. I finish by saying this with enormous gratitude. I feel incredibly fortunate to have been associated with ApetoGentlemen, their reach, their platform, and their willingness to help place meaningful education in front of millions of people globally. Genuinely care about improving patient education. It feels like we are only just beginning, because education truly does change lives in this space. Education is key, and truthfully, we will probably never fully know the real impact the article has had. We will never know how many mistakes it prevented, how many vulnerable people it helped slow down before making irreversible decisions, or how many lives it may genuinely have changed for the better. But if even one frightened person found enough clarity, reassurance, or perspective through that work to avoid emotional collapse or catastrophic decision-making, then honestly, every difficult conversation surrounding it was probably well worth it. And as they say in the business, onwards and upwards.